California is different. That's our superpower. We're the state where big ideas take off, with discoveries and technology, from music to movies to movements. What if we all came together to envision our long-term future, where everyone is given the opportunity to succeed, where all of our neighborhoods are healthy and strong? We are California 100. We engage communities from every corner of the state to design a better future. We are students and parents, researchers and organizers, entrepreneurs and policymakers. And we are harnessing the state's immense talent with dozens of research and innovation projects to ensure California's leadership well into the next century. We can do this. After all, we are the Golden State, a place of dreamers and doers. So come join us. Let's think big and different. Let's create the next 100 years, starting today.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Karthik Ramakrishnan, and I'm the Executive Director of California 100. On behalf of our wonderful staff, our commission, our research partners, and advisors, I would like to welcome you to California 100's very first event, Scenarios for the State's Infrastructure Future. Many of you have been following us since we announced our research partners in the summer of 2021. Some of you may be new to our work. Either way, we're excited to have you here and share more about our initiative with you. California 100 envisions a future that is innovative, sustainable, and equitable for all. Our mission is to strengthen California's ability to collectively solve problems and to shape our long-term future through research, which you'll hear more about today, policy innovation, advanced technology, and engagement. By identifying, mobilizing, and supporting champions for change for innovative and equitable solutions. Key to our work is getting young Californians engaged and involved, sparking an intergenerational conversation, and yes, a movement to prioritize long-term futures and build up towards a vision and set of strategies that can propel California forward, making sure that we remain a state not only of innovation, but a state of inclusion. Now, people have been asking us what the 100 in California 100 means. As you may guess, 100 means 100 years. And that kind of blows people's minds. It kind of blew my mind when I first started in this work with colleagues. We chose 100 because it's the easiest way to talk about long-term futures thinking and future investments. But in addition to 100 years, the 100 represents much more. It also represents what we need to do today, to think about what it takes to give California our 100, about what it takes to make California 100, as perfection as all that California can be. Over the past number of months, our team has challenged and harnessed the immense research talent of more than 20 centers and institutes across the state to examine where we've been and where we are when it comes to our areas of focus, but also to explore possible scenarios for our future. That's what today's about. Our first 4 reports were published today: the future of transportation, future of housing, the future of energy, environment, and natural resources, and the future of advanced technology and basic research. In addition to the research partners you see here today, and others who are co-authors in the work, I would like to give a shout out to the Institute for the Future for their support and thought partnership in this work. All of us in the California 100 team are also extremely grateful to the University of California system, to the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, to Stanford University and its Institute for Economic and Policy Research for believing in us and helping to incubate and support this important and path-breaking work. One joke I say is that this initiative is bringing together Cal and Stanford, UCLA and USC. I think we're already making our way in building unity in our state. Now, it's no coincidence that we're here at the California Museum tonight, a place that exemplifies the best of California's yesterday and today, for us to have a discussion and dream about California's tomorrow. We cannot plan our future without understanding our past. In doing so here in Sacramento, we pay homage to the traditional homes of the Maidu, Miwok, and Nisenan people who have been caretakers of the area for many centuries and continue to remain resilient and vibrant as federally recognized and unrecognized tribes, bands, and rancherias. In acknowledging our past, I also reflect on my own personal journey as a Californian. I'm an immigrant to the United States, and 20 years ago, I became an immigrant to California. As a poster in the California Endowment poignantly declares, I was not born in California, but California was born in me. And that is true for so many of us, with or without status here. This too is part of the story of California and California 100. In this journey, we're also joined by a commissioner like Geneva Wiki, who as a member of the Yurok tribe, reminds us that intergenerational and multi-generational work has been going on in California well before there was a California. And a commissioner like Michael Tubbs, who's written beautifully about being raised by 3 mothers and is working to end poverty in California. This is the kind of big and bold thinking that California 100 represents through our commissioners. I'll also mention a commissioner like Alvin Lee, who was not even born when I came to California almost 20 years ago. And he has started a youth movement organization called Gen Up that has already helped pass legislation and influence funding in California. These journeys and hundreds more are the story of California 100, and we're just getting started. We can't wait for you to join us in the weeks and months ahead. Now, before we move on, I'd just like to recognize some special guests who are here. Senator Pan, Dr. Pan, who's here and is an important champion of the work that California does. We have Kathleen Kelly Janis, who's Senior Advisor to the Governor on Social Innovation. I thought I saw Maricela Rodriguez here as well, who is key to civic engagement and community engagement in the governor's office. Maricela, so great to see you. And I'm probably missing a few. I was so glad to meet in person Sam Asefa, who is the director of the Office of Planning and Research in the governor's office. These are a few among several who are going to be so critical to the work, because what we see here today is some amazing research by world-class research institutions. But we can't have these research, it doesn't sit on a shelf anymore. It's in people's download folders, right? But we can't just have the research stand on its own and not have impact. So we see this as the beginning of not only a conversation, but a set of designs, a set of activities, a set of planning and engagement with government agencies, with industry, with nonprofit organizations, and everyday Californians, including young Californians, to make sure that we are able to create the future we would all like to see. Thank you, everyone, and I would like to now introduce our first speaker, who is Brian Taylor, who's the director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. Brian?
Thank you very much, and good late afternoon. With the exception of walks on the beach and cruising on Saturday night, people travel not for the sake of moving about, but to access opportunities. Access to school, to jobs, groceries, healthcare, and more are keys to quality lives. Similarly, firms access suppliers, labor, and customers via transportation systems as well. Because travel is largely a means to an end, it's hard to talk about transportation systems without talking about the origins and destinations they link together. Indeed, the 4 futures we analyzed for the California 100 project pair transportation futures on one axis and land use futures on the other. We focus in particular on motor vehicles because that's what most Californians use for most trips. In places where homes and businesses are spaced widely and free parking is abundant, Cars and trucks are fast and comfortable ways to access opportunities. But in places where development and densities are high and where homes and businesses sit cheek to jowl, the speed and spaciousness of cars can become a liability. It's in such places that it's often easy to walk to nearby destinations, and frequent public transit service can make getting around easy as well. In addition, limited street space often slows cars to a crawl, and parking is typically cumbersome and expensive. In between these two extremes are suburbs where residents typically have neither the benefit of frequent public transit service nor easy ways to access places without cars. And it is in many of California's growing areas that battles are being waged between urbanizing forces on one hand and efforts to keep densities low and cars king on the other. Keeping development densities low as possible in order to make driving as easy as possible is our scenario 3. You'll need a car to get around, which would keep housing sprawling and increasingly expensive and travel a challenge for those unable to drive. Keeping those densities low, but while investing more in walking, biking, and public transit infrastructure is our scenario 4. Lots of travel choices, but most will drive. This low-density future would make it hard for these alternative transportation investments to pay off, and affordable housing would likely be hard to come by. This is the future our panel of experts thought as most likely right now, but not most desirable. Allowing development densities to rise, but where most people still drive for most trips, is our scenario 1. More city living, but lots of traffic. Like the previous scenario, this one is also a transportation land use mismatch. But here, access advantages of agglomeration are lost amid endemic traffic congestion. Finally, allowing many of California's cities and suburbs to urbanize while developing companion walking, biking, and public transit infrastructure to serve the denser development is our scenario 2. Easy to get around without a car. Here, driving will still be the norm in most outlying areas, though it'll be less common in suburbs and increasingly rare in big city centers, where many will enjoy high levels of access without having to drive. If done right, housing will be closer to jobs and more affordable. Emissions and congestion will be reduced, and more Californians will thrive. How can we get there? It won't be easy, as resistance to change is the norm and not the exception, and trust in government today is unfortunately low. Building more trust in the public sector will not entail this or that policy change, but ongoing efforts at all levels of government to demonstrate fairness, transparency about motives in decision-making, competency and inclusiveness in program design, and reliable follow-through. One way to do this would be to amend the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, to reduce the current adversarial comment and response nature of community engagement. Another way to build trust for the state would be to work more closely with communities to better mitigate and repair the many harms caused by decades of urban freeway development. On the land use side of our transportation land use matrix, we need to shift our predominant focus on increasingly expensive single-family residential housing sprawling out into fire-prone exurbs. To do this, the state may need to substantially curtail single-family zoning to enable more infill, affordable, and less car-dependent housing. On the transportation side of the ledger, managing driving is essential. Allowing people to drive anywhere they want, anytime they want, as much as they want, may be okay in Alturas or Brawley, but it's extraordinarily wasteful in Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, and other big California cities. One way to manage driving would begin by managing parking. Currently, local governments set minimum parking requirements to essentially ensure that all drivers have a free parking space at the end of their trip. Often this means parking lots that are bigger than the businesses they're built for, and with lots of mostly underused parking. These local regulations waste land that could be used for housing and bury the high cost of free parking in the price of groceries, restaurant meals, rents, and so on, which subsidizes driving. If California were to prohibit governments from imposing minimum parking requirements, businesses would still get to decide how much parking to drive, but almost certainly drivers would be more often paying for the parking they consume, especially in cities. The result, less land wasted on unused parking, more land for businesses and housing, would make it easier for people to consider alternatives to driving. This would increase travel by other modes, reduce emissions, and congestion in the process. In the face of crippling housing shortage and affordability crisis and ever-worsening traffic congestion, California needs to pursue more equitable, sustainable, and vibrant transportation future, or the California dream is in danger of becoming a nightmare. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian, and we'll hear a lot more about this in the Q&A with our respondents, as well as hearing more from Brian. Now, Brian mentioned housing, and so I'm pleased to invite Carolina Reid from the UC Berkeley Terner Center for Housing Innovation.
Carolina first, so that's why I jumped like I've been jolted.
Thank you. Before I start, I want to acknowledge my colleagues on the California 100 Housing and Community Development team. This research was led by Shane Phillips at the Lewis Center at UCLA, and with Dana Cuff and Kenny Wong of City Lab, also at UCLA. California 100 asked us to imagine the future, drawing on past and present trends. We posed the question, what will housing in California look like in the next 10, 20, 100 years? We imagined 4 different scenarios, each of which hinges on critical decisions we make today based on 2 interrelated factors. 1, how much new housing do we build and where? And 2, how deeply we value and prioritize social and racial equity. At one extreme, the scenario we call new feudalisms largely preserves the status quo, with the trends of the last few decades continuing well into the future. We continue to build much less housing than we actually need. The housing that does get built is priced at luxury price points, while more moderately priced developments are located on the exurban fringe, increasing commutes and putting more homes at risk from wildfires. House values continue to rise, with most of the gains going to older white homeowners and Wall Street investors. The black-white homeownership gap continues to widen, and middle-class families and jobs leave to other lower-cost cities. The number of people experiencing homelessness continues to grow, and the politics around housing become ever more polarized, with every local project becoming a referendum on what is being built and for whom. The default position remains, we are in support of housing, just not here. But there is a different path, one that the majority of stakeholders we interviewed would like to see California take. We call this scenario housing for all. It's a future where we build more housing, where rents and house prices fall in line with incomes, where housing security and stability is shared by all, and people aren't displaced from their homes or communities, where homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring, and where we finally make a commitment to ending racial discrimination in housing and mortgage markets and redress the legacy of past harms. There are policies that will put us on this different path, and the past few years provide reason for optimism. The state legislature has finally made housing a priority and has passed a series of critical reforms that make it easier to build lower-cost, denser housing. The state has also committed unprecedented amounts of funding to address homelessness and piloting innovative approaches such as HomeKey to build affordable housing more quickly. Innovation is happening at the local level as well, like the Transit-Oriented Communities program in Los Angeles and the Small Sites Acquisition program in San Francisco. But more is needed. A future that provides housing for all will require that the state prioritize both housing supply and social equity equally. What might that look like? First, focus on renters. Today, the majority of public funding for housing benefits higher income homeowners by a ratio of approximately 3 to 1. Less than 1 in 4 renters who qualifies for housing support receives it. It's time to change this. There's lots of possible approaches to this, but here's one. California could pilot a real renter's tax credit. The credit would build on the demonstrated success of policies like the child tax credit and would increase housing stability, choice, and savings among renters. It would also support racial equity goals. Wouldn't it be amazing if California showed that it is possible to eliminate rent burdens and insecurity for low-income families, just as it has led the nation on issues such as climate change? Second, continue to focus on removing barriers to new housing. The state has taken important steps in this direction, but there remain strong headwinds, most notably local resistance to new housing. The state should not back down on using its authority to hold all jurisdictions accountable to building housing for people at all income levels. Meaningfully expanding production will also require grappling with real reforms to CEQA and limiting the practice of discretionary reviews on a project-by-project basis. Third, recognize and address systemic racism. Disparities in housing and mortgage market outcomes by race and ethnicity, especially for Black households, remain profound. Communities of color are subject to ongoing cycles of disinvestment and speculation, residential exclusion and segregation, and discrimination. Ending this will require concerted efforts across multiple housing areas, including, but not limited to, strengthening fair housing, providing legal assistance against evictions, and expanding access to sustainable homeownership. It will also require that the state invest more in BIPOC-led efforts, such as community land trusts and cooperatives. The path to a more sustainable future is straightforward, but not simple. It will require a fundamental shift in how we prioritize public resources, and it will require confronting third-rail political issues like Prop 13, CEQA, and local land use control. I want to thank the Cal 100 team for creating a space to discuss these issues. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Next, we're joined by Sean Randolph from the Bay Area Economic Council, who's going to be presenting some high-level findings in the research on advanced technology and basic research. Sean.
Thanks very much, Karthik, and thanks to California 100 for allowing this work to be done. I want to thank also Brian Brennan and the Silicon Valley Leadership Group for partnering us on this project. Our report confirmed what a lot of us already know, that California retains its title as the world's leading economy for technology, for innovation, and for entrepreneurship. And there's a ton of data behind that. You go into our report, it doesn't stop. Preponderance of the largest, most capitalized companies in the world, tech companies. 50% of all the venture capital investment in the United States in California. 45% of all the unicorns in the United States in California. 45% of the companies in the tech IPO pipeline in California. So it's pretty remarkable. And while this is most concentrated in the Bay Area, we also looked at vibrant places like San Diego, Greater Los Angeles, places in the Central Valley around Merced, around UC Davis, and found really dynamic technology development and innovation happening there. So we titled our paper The Golden Goose because more than any other one industry, tech drives California's economy. What jobs are growing during the pandemic? It's been tech jobs. What's been the biggest engine for job growth in California? It's been tech. And with California's budget surplus, guess where that comes from? The surplus comes from personal income taxes, taxes on IPOs. This is all coming, or predominantly coming, from tech. So there are a lot of key inputs to that. There's the universities in particular, especially University of California. There's public funding for scientific research. But when we asked, what's the one driver? Is there one single thing that most influences our capacity for technology innovation and for science? It's talent. It's human talent. If we have the talent, the research will happen here, the venture capital will come here, the other investment will happen here, and the companies will be here. If we don't have the talent, or if it starts to drift away, guess what? The investment's not coming, the venture capital is going to drift away, the scientific talent is going to drift away to other places. So we talked to a lot of technology leaders, especially tech investors, about what they think about what's going on. And the good news was there is almost unanimity that California really retains the crown. There is no imminent threat to its leadership because it has such a density and a unique combination of remarkable assets. But they also very quickly pointed to things that they're concerned about, things that could erode our position in the future if we don't pay attention and act. There's public underfunding for public higher education. Funding for UC is half of what it was at the turn of the century. Constraints on high-skilled immigration that we benefit in California from more than any place else in the world. People from around the world who have skills and talent they want to bring here. And quality of life. Well, what goes into that? The biggest issue, and this is really just a huge topic, is housing. Housing costs more here than any place in the US, except for maybe Manhattan. That's been the case for a while, but guess what? With remote work, more tech workers can live almost anywhere they want. Where are they going? If they leave, they're going to places where they can, guess what? Afford housing. And we're seeing more California companies. It's not an exodus yet, but noticeably more companies leaving the state in the last 2 years. They're going sometimes for regulatory reasons, sometimes it's taxation. They're often going to where the talent is, and a lot of their employees, if they're in another city outside California, they're following that. So housing is the big problem there, the one thing we can solve. The other is actually environmental. Smoke from wildfires. It's going to get worse. And if 3 or 4 months of the year we have red air, I think that's just another factor, an environmental factor, where quality of life was a plus for so many years for California. It may not be so much now. So that led us to 4 scenarios. I'll only mention 2, the good one and the bad one. The good one is the pie's getting bigger. This is one where we invest in public higher education, the UC system, the CSU system, the community college system. We address our fundamental deep housing issues about housing cost and availability. We address transportation, and the best and the brightest from around the world and around the country in this scenario continue to come to California, and we keep the lead. The other one, the worst scenario, we call at least, or on the bright side, housing is cheaper. In fact, housing becomes more unaffordable, more technology talent leaves the state, companies follow them, the environment does not get that much better, VC funding looks elsewhere in the country for talent, and competitors like China come up and eat some of that pie. So the scenario we want is, guess what? It's the pie is getting bigger. And how do we get there? So the report puts forward a number of ideas. It's a significant list, but things like increased opportunities and access for minority communities in the tech and innovation world. They're kind of not there right now. There need to be more opportunities for their talent, their entrepreneurship. Invest in clean energy and climate resilience. Among a lot of other things, we're really competitive in that in California. If we could do that and address that at home, maybe we won't have this 3 months a year of red skies. Rebuilding advanced manufacturing. You need manufacturing to have a balanced, healthy economy. These are jobs in the middle, especially advanced manufacturing. We've lost a lot of that. Think about things like semiconductor. $52 billion in federal money going into the semiconductor industry very soon, a lot for manufacturing. Can we capture some of that here in California? Incentivizing R&D through a revitalized R&D tax credit, and also leveraging the capacity of the University of California and the CSU system to help grow new innovation centers in the state where they aren't now. We're seeing it happen already in the Central Valley around Merced and Davis, and Fresno with CSU Fresno. It could happen on the North Coast around Humboldt State. Lots of ways to leverage, especially these amazing assets, CSU and UC, which have proven to be engines of economic development and engines of talent. And if we can grow more technology communities and innovation communities near them, that's a real opportunity. That means strengthening our support for UC, strengthening our support and investment for CSUs, and at a different level, keeping the door open for high-skilled immigrants from around the world. Almost half of the tech companies in California are founded by people who came here from another country. And you know what? More than half of the unicorns in this state, more than half of the leading name brand technology companies are, guess what? Founded by immigrants. Lower level, triple the number of students in California taking computer science. They're doing this in other countries. They're doing it in Israel. Why can't we do it in California? And lastly, create a comprehensive California innovation and technology strategy. It doesn't have to be prescriptive. It's not a law, but there is so much to work with. There's so much on the line that we could really use a comprehensive view from the state about what to invest in and what works and what we need to address. So Bottom line, our strength is based on our talent base. We have the best in the world right now, but we can't take it for granted. It would be a huge mistake if we did. And for California to keep this leading position in science and technology into the future, we need to really clearly understand what our weak points are, address them, and invest in the assets that have made us what we are, which is the world's leading center for science and technology. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. When I heard something like 40% of the unicorns, I was like, well, clearly we're not talking about fantasy land here. So in non-jargon speak, unicorns are companies with at least $1 billion in valuation. I'll also would not be doing my job if I didn't also represent the Inland Empire with the kinds of innovation we have at UC Riverside, Cal State San Bernardino, and so many just amazing, innovative individuals and organizations. And I think that's just something that's just so important to note, that innovation happens everywhere in California, but the investments and opportunities are not happening everywhere in California. And it's not just in terms of geography. When you look at distressed neighborhoods in many of these places, literally miles away from some of these tech titans, there's so much talent and innovation happening there. What can we do to make sure that the promise of all of that investment is there for all? So thank you, Brian, for teeing it up, and I'm just really looking forward to the conversation. Finally, we have David Wooley from the UC Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy's Center for Environmental Public Policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Karthik. I want to thank the organizers of California 100, the commissioners, the staff, for asking us to envision a future for 5 key California sectors: electricity, transport, mostly road transport, though we looked at boats, trains, boats, and planes, buildings, industry, and water. And we looked at these sectors from with a focus on climate impacts, mitigation, and adaptation opportunities in these increasingly interactive sectors, and also the importance of California leadership in these areas nationally and globally. We identified 4 future scenarios driven by 2 key variables. One was the health of the overall economy, both state and national, and 2, alignment of people and government with a zero carbon future. The first scenario, and this is my favorite one, I think it's the most likely, is a future where California's environment and economy thrive in a transition to a life without oil and gas. I think there's very good reason to believe that California can lead the nation and the world to a prosperous, climate-friendly economy and culture. And Sean's comments earlier interact with this conclusion quite strongly. A second scenario was one where we had broad public support, but a constrained economic downturn, which limit the ability to invest, particularly in clean energy alternatives. A third scenario was a healthy economy, but political changes that weaken the public support and government ability to address greenhouse gas emissions. The indicator for this is who gets back in the White House. The fourth scenario involves a tragic combination of economic downturn and pro-fossil fuel policies, which essentially doom the state to be able to conquer its fossil fuel dependency, and with the loss of California leadership, the inability of the nation and world to follow. Under this scenario, California experiences recurring weather disasters, climate-induced migration, collapse of agriculture, tourism, public health, trade, and access to capital and talent. Clearly, these are existential futures. This is an existentially risky future, one that we have to fight really hard to avoid, and failure is not an option. Well, we came up with a lot of recommendations, I think about 75 across these 5 sectors, differentiated by the scenarios. Tonight, I'm just going to mention a few of the most important, primarily from that first optimistic scenario. Well, we're well on our way, thanks to leadership in California over many years, toward a decarbonization of electricity sector and transport. Renewable energy and storage plus storage is now the least cost option, not only here, but nationally. Electric vehicles are less costly to own and operate than gasoline or diesel cars and trucks, including heavy-duty trucks. But we still need policy support to fully build out electric vehicle charging networks. But we need to build a new industry for battery manufacturing and recycling, particularly vehicle battery recycling. We have to phase out internal combustion engine sales gradually between 2024 and 2025, and phase out oil and gas production and refining. Lastly, I think it's important that we develop a new industry, an offshore wind energy generation industry. All this costs less than it saves in the electric power and transportation sectors. A similar story with regard to buildings. Heat pump technology today costs less than installing gas in new buildings. That'll soon be true with regard to existing buildings. To get gas out of buildings, we need to be able to develop incentives to replace old furnaces, water heaters, and stoves as they age out, and to decommission the gas distribution pipelines under the streets and into the buildings. In industry, I think it's really important to recognize that California may be on the verge of a climate policy-driven reindustrialization. There are entirely plausible scenarios by which we can decarbonize or reduce the carbon associated with steel, cement, chemicals, and waste industries through renewable hydrogen industry development, procurement, and sustainable finance. We can't forget about water. We need to really redouble our efforts to restore the rapidly depleting groundwater resources in the state. We have to create a greatly larger industry of water recycling. We need to pay farms and foresters to retain water and carbon in soils. Adaptation, there's a whole series of really critical equity issues associated with prioritizing reducing exposure to air pollution and climate risk for the most vulnerable populations, and to transition workforces, particularly in oil and gas production and refining. I want to close just by saying I'm struck by the connection between climate actions and political freedom worldwide. We have a long history of wars that are based on dependence on fossil fuels. I ask this audience to do what you can to reduce the suffering and conflict in the Ukraine, and there are things you can do. In your daily lives, businesses and government work, reduce fossil fuel use. We calculate that a 10% reduction in fossil fuel use in residential and commercial buildings will create a surplus of gas that can be exported to the EU, enough to displace 1/3 of the Russian gas exports. The same is true with regard to oil and gasoline use. This will reduce funding for Putin's war machine, and it can be done without new fossil fuel production and export capacity. Well, this will shrink our own vulnerability to fossil fuel prices and supply. It's a future to which I believe California can lead the world. It's one that leads us away from climate catastrophe leads us away from petrodictators holding the world hostage to a dirty and obsolete resource. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And now we're going to move to the more interactive part of our evening. But one thing I'll say, David, just recently, I think many of you saw this news that, as part of, the need in Europe for natural gas, we are now talking about increasing capacity, to be able to export liquefied natural gas from the US to Europe. They say it'll take 2 to 3 years to build up that capacity, but it's going to lock us in for the next 30 years.
It's not an option. It takes too long. It won't give the Europeans the relief they need in the short term. So my suggestion is, let's conserve more. Let's use less of this stuff. Create a surplus that can be exported with existing infrastructure. Great. I think that can be done.
Thank you, David. Well, we have 2 guests here who've been sitting and waiting patiently. They've read all the reports. They've consumed a lot over the last few days. So I'm joined here by Erica Manuel, who's the CEO and Executive Director of the Institute for Local Government. She's also our brand new advisor to California 100 that we'll be announcing in a few days, and brings a lot of expertise. And we'll say more later when we talk about local governments. But in addition, we have Annie Fryman, one of our commissioners, an expert in housing, was in the legislature and fielded a lot of calls. I'm sure not that many happy calls from constituents. A mix of calls about what we need to do to produce more housing, make it more sustainable, make it more affordable. And is now in the private sector, working in a company that tries to make accessory dwelling units much more common and much more accessible and equitable in California and Washington State. But first, I'll turn it over to Erica. Erica, you've heard a lot today. You've read a lot over the last few days.
Also, yes.
What are some big ideas that you've seen that you think we need to dig into more, and even some other ideas that you see in your line of work that you think we need to consider?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Karthik, the entire California 100 team. As you mentioned, I'm with the Institute for Local Government. And what ILG does is we work with cities, counties, and special districts. So you think about the 482 cities up and down the state, the 58 counties, 2,500 special districts. That is really where the rubber hits the road as it relates to policy. And so what our organization does, we're a nonprofit, we're nonpartisan, but what we do is we help operationalize policy. We help make sure that things work on the ground. We help government work a little bit better. And we work closely with them to do that, given all of the complexity, all of the changing priorities and shifting policies at all levels. And so reading these reports, I came to it certainly with that lens, but I also came to it with the lens of a native Californian, of someone who grew up in 2 places, kind of bi-coastal, if I might say, grew up in the Bay Area, spent a lot of time there, and then also had dual citizenship, as I call it, in the Central Valley. And the Central Valley, if you've lived there, it's a different beast altogether. And so I read these reports thinking about my friends and family that are literally still in the Central Valley, thinking about whether or not they have to drive 100 miles to get to a well-paying job, how much pollution is involved in doing that. I think about my mom driving 45 miles to the nearest doctor. I think about my cousins, right, in East Oakland or in Compton who have lower life expectancy, who have lower health outcomes because of policies made 50 years ago, thinking about the discriminatory housing policies like redlining, right? So when I read those reports, and there are a lot of content in them, I thought about how do we operationalize a dream? How do we make this actually take place? How do we make it happen? How do we make the rubber hit the road at the local government level? And it occurred to me that there's no way I can talk about all 4 reports. They are fantastic, by the way. But I kept thinking yes and when I read the recommendations. Yes and, let's do that. Yes, let's do that. That sounds great, let's do that. And I can tell you with our constituents, the ones we work with, they are also supportive of so many of these ideas. And many of them are advancing on some of those things. But I will say that the things that I saw that were cross-pollinating on all the reports, there were 3 things. One is education, the other one is engagement, and another one is equity. All of the reports had some thread of that throughout. And then when I say education, I don't just mean education on the higher ed side, which I think we absolutely need from a manufacturing and a tech standpoint. To keep innovation moving, we need it. But I also think there's education at the K-12 level, and investments have to be made there. And they also have to be made with the general public to understand the issues that we're actually facing and to help drive that groundswell of support. Because where the local government hits is that they see a public that's not fully informed, doesn't understand why it matters, and doesn't understand how it connects to them. So if you talk about NIMBYism, right, not in my backyard, and it's the housing barrier, people don't always understand all the issues or the nuance for it. On the engagement side, engagement is hard. Somebody mentioned CEQA. CEQA is a hornet's nest, but that's not the only way that people engage. And at the local government level, it's very difficult to have authentic engagement. ILG teaches that. We certainly work closely to do it, but we've got to do more on the engagement side. And I don't mean exclusively on the public engagement side. I think also on the policymaker side, because policies are often dropped down from the heavens, and then we have to implement them. But they don't always work when it comes time to getting it done. And that's not for lack of goodwill, but sometimes it's for lack of capacity. There are some great programs out there. OPR is one, SGC is another, the Strategic Growth Council, that are working to help build capacity at the local government level. I love so many of these ideas, but where we see the road bumps and the speed bumps is in getting it done. Not because they don't want to, but because they can't. Workforce issues are problematic across all local governments. We've got to tackle that too, so that we can make changes here. I don't think you're going to find a ton of pushback on some of these items, but local agencies need a little help to do that. The last thing I would say is the equity piece, and I think about it in all ways, certainly from a racial standpoint, but also think about the distinction between a San Francisco or a San Jose or a Needles or McFarland. You've got a city of 5,000 people. And and Needles and McFarland are a great example of water infrastructure that needs complete overhauls, roads that need complete overhauls. So, and we've got state grant programs that are focused on innovation, but we need to repair an existing well. I know Needles, for example, has one working well right now, because 3 of them don't meet compliance. So we've got to figure out how to do yes and, how to do more, how to do both. And I think you have support at the local government level for so many of these things, but we need to figure out how to work together, how to operationalize this dream. And I think when we have shared values at the community level, at the local government level, the state level, the federal level, it can get done. I'm optimistic in all the hats that I wear because I see so much potential here. And somebody said that, California was born in me, both and I would love to see us do this, and some of this is absolutely doable, and I'm excited to read more.
Thank you so much, Erica. I love that. How do you operationalize a dream? I think that's really what California 100 is about. It's about dreaming, but making it real.
Make it real.
Yeah. Want to turn over to Annie. Annie, specific to housing, but even more generally in terms of reactions. But what are some of the big ideas you heard today? And then how do we make them real?
Of course. Well, thank you again for everyone being here today, and thank you for inviting me as the California 100 Commissioner present tonight. The big ideas that I really took away, I think both in framework and in content from these 4 reports, I had the perspective, obviously from my own life experience, starting my career as an architect and working just with the rules that we have in the system that we have as a normal practitioner, seeing all the places where the process didn't work, where it was not aligned with the values we claim to have, where the rules were outdated and needed to be modernized, and actually took that into getting more involved in community organizing and engagement, getting more involved in elections, getting more involved in advocacy broadly, and ultimately making a career move to working in policy, which landed me in the state legislature, working on housing, land use, and transportation. I sort of see that step as you have to know what's broken to know how to fix it. And then you work on fixing things little by little, incrementally, understanding and unraveling the constraints that decision makers really are dealing with and wrestling with and grappling with. And now that I've left, I have the perspective of, okay, we've changed a lot on paper. How do we implement that? And how do we not just have it that the decision makers want something left the legislature or the governor's desk or the regulations process is on paper, but actually how does do those decisions impact real people's real lives in a positive and forward-moving way, the way that they were intended? And so in reading these 4 reports, one thing that I really kept coming back to are at each step of the way that distinguishes which of these 4 scenarios, which part of the matrix are we in essentially, which quadrant is the future that we're gearing towards, what decision makers are involved in that, what constraints are those decision makers following, and what values are guiding how they navigate those decisions. The housing and transportation topic areas, I think, really spoke to this specifically in, are we making decisions as policymakers and as voters agnostic in the housing case to private gain, agnostic to property value increases, or are we making decisions agnostic to racial and social equity outcomes? And I think that that's just a little bit of inversion in how the researchers framed these. Are we making our transportation decisions, for example, agnostic to short-term impacts on traffic or not? Are we making those decisions agnostic to short-term infrastructure investments that are going to have pretty extraordinary overhead up front, but will absolutely pay for themselves down the line, not just financially, but also in quality of life and outcomes? And so taking that back, I think that really building on what Erica said about operationalizing the dream, not just operationalizing it in the as California 100, how are the thinkers navigating this, but also really getting down into the nuts and bolts of what is the flowchart of decisions that are hard, that need to be made along the process? What are the incentives that each of those decision makers are faced with? What are the constraints and parameters that each of them are faced with? And how do you set up the system such that people can be set up for success in making decisions that set us toward that ideal future that's really outlined in each of these reports? We're on track for some of them, we're not on track for others, and I think that that really highlights, and credit to the researchers on this, where there are interventions needed, not just in public investment, but also in the structures that are set up to give people good or bad incentives that naturally flow the gravity in certain directions that we'd like to see in our future.
Great. Thank you so much, Annie. Before I go back to our researchers, I want to give a very special shout out to Lindsay Maple, who's here, who is our Deputy Director of Research. And yeah, we can clap. Who has done so much work behind the scenes over these past several months, as well as Henry Brady, former dean, a longtime dean at the Goldman School of Public Policy, who's watching this remotely on a live stream. He's in New York temporarily. He'll be back to California. We rest assure you on that. But Henry is our Director of Research, really helped bring so many different streams of work together. So I want to make sure that we recognize their contributions to this work as well. We've had some questions come in. We're running a little short on time. I want to turn to Carolina and ask about housing, especially, I mean, and it's not a gotcha question at all. Of course, local governments are supportive. State has certain interests. But where the rubber meets the road is some of those thorny questions, especially when local governments have very little financial incentive and are facing all sorts of fiscal strains to be asked to develop more housing when there can be more lucrative land uses around. So how do we solve that?
So I think you've pinpointed one of the most challenging things to solve. And Erica, I really appreciated your comments because the state legislature really has passed a lot of housing laws in the last few years. And we consistently hear from local governments, we have to know exactly what to do. I think some of that is really well-meaning. I think certainly when we look at the Central Valley, the problem of funding is huge, especially when it comes to affordable housing. There's not nearly as much gap financing as in other parts of the state.
Brian,
Yes.
we're seeing some stories about San Diego County that is trying to think long-term in terms of vehicle miles traveled and somehow taxing that. But it now seems to be a populist issue, potentially, right, where people are saying, we're seeing sky-high gas prices already, and now they're talking about introducing even more burdens, even though from an economic equity perspective, it probably is more progressive, right? Because it's people who have fully electric cars that don't pay gas taxes that will be affected by it. How do we enact policies that make sense for our long-term futures when political officials that are trying to propose this face short-term pushback?
Imagine a world where we financed electricity with property taxes and sales taxes, and your use of electricity was unrelated to anything other than what you pay in property and sales taxes. What we would probably have is inadequate capital to build enough generating capacity, and we'd have a brownout and rolling blackouts every morning and every afternoon. That's what our transportation system is. Okay, so what we often find is that equity concerns are raised, and they're valid, about why we can't meter road use in some way, manage road use. And the arguments are, well, that could hurt poor people. Well, certainly we have lifeline rights and other things. We don't propose giving electricity to everyone, rich and poor, for free in order to help low-income people. But we do make that argument about our road system. And right now, we're scaling our cities. We're scaling development and housing around the ability to drive. Now, when you raised, well, we want to tax or somehow charge people, the idea is that we want to meter this so that we get much more efficiency in the system. I want it to be a fabulous experience driving at rush hour in San Francisco. Fabulous, but rare. It's something that you wouldn't do because that land under those roads is incredibly valuable, yet we give that away for free. The land underneath streets in San Francisco and Los Angeles is just as valuable as the land that we develop on, yet we price that exactly the same everywhere around the state. And what happens is that elected officials understandably say, this just seems like, oh my gosh, anything else but this. So we start with the original sin, which is that we will not manage automobile use. And then we start to scale housing and development, everything else we do around that preconceived notion that we can't manage automobile use, even though it's lousy driving around cities in the dense cities during rush hours. It's, coming out of the pandemic, VMT is back up, it's back. So people chafe at how bad the system is and say, absolutely, we're not going to meter road use in any way. So we have a chronic shortage of road every morning and every afternoon, and we take that as given. What they're trying in San Diego is to say, well, we could meter road use. We could show how it could work really well. And we do have some examples. So the State Route 91 express lanes between Corona and Riverside in Southern California. Bumper-to-bumper traffic, but you can pay to travel through there. And actually, about 40% of all the people who get through that corridor go in those 2 lanes, and about 60% go in the other 5 lanes. It's incredibly efficient. It doesn't expand because people get used to the idea that, if you're in a small town, you wouldn't need to do that. Right. And we just assume that it's just the only thing we can do is get to a city and have a nightmarish commute to Silicon Valley or a nightmarish commute to the west side of LA. That's just the way it is. We can't build any more high-density housing. Why? Because it'll make traffic worse. We are scaling our cities around this idea that we're managing traffic. And of course, we're not managing traffic. So where we'd have to begin with is somehow managing automobile use, again, to make it really terrific all the time. But like a hotel or a flight during the holiday season, it's much more expensive than at other times. We just accept that that's the case. But here we say, no, we give it away free at all times. And oh gosh, isn't it terrible? Let's try and keep densities low.
Yeah. And
that political dilemma, San Diego's going to run into it again. They're going to say no because you're just trying to punish me for driving. That's not what we want to do. We want to make driving better, but rarer.
Yeah, and I think this gets back to what Erica was saying in terms of education, right? And it is that public engagement, persuasion, hard to do when we have sound bites, right. Kind of short-term thinking, short-term cycles. Accountability cycles for elected officials.
So that dialogue, but you asked how, I think small pilot projects, try things out. Don't wait to get everyone's approval on it. Just try pilots and then come back to people. Yeah. See what they
Let's do it. That's key to innovation often, right? Is to not experiment on an entire state. Let's try some of these pilot programs. Example of water recycling, as I understand it, California is a leader in the country in terms of water agencies doing more when it comes to recycling down in San Diego, but also Metropolitan Water District. I happen to go on a walk every Saturday, and one of my neighbors on this walk works for Metropolitan Water District. And they're working on a 30-year project to do massive recycling of water in NWD. And that's something that is worth encouraging and proliferating throughout the state. Finally, I'm going to turn over to Sean Randolph to talk about, so housing pops up in so many ways. And that might be surprising to a lot of people, to think that the future of advanced technology in California depends on affordable housing, shorter commute times. Can you say a bit more? Is this just a Bay Area issue, or are you seeing it in other parts of the state as well?
No, it's across the state. Clearly, any major urban area, it's an issue, less so in the Central Valley, but where the tech companies and the tech workers are clustered, it's enormous. And it's not unlike you're seeing for any resident of the state, except that tech workers, and this is a really large, broad group, they're mobile. And the cost of living has been, we've known for at least 2 decades, a major detriment in California. We have so many other assets, but if you talk to people, like what's not good, it's the cost of living. What drives the cost of living? It's the cost of housing. The highest in the United States and at any given moment in the Bay Area, not far behind in LA, not far behind that in San Diego. You compare it to almost anywhere in the US. So I think the concern from a tech standpoint is when our business model was that everybody needed to be in one place, they needed to come into an office and they needed to be interacting, and you had this benefit of aggregation. So many people in a small area of Silicon Valley or other parts of California, and there was a benefit to the interaction, the innovation that comes from that, and it hasn't gone away. But now, with the pandemic and remote work, in the Bay Area, we have more jobs eligible for remote work, almost 50%, 45%, than anywhere else in the United States. And people have taken advantage of that. Some have gone out to the Central Valley. That's maybe good. Maybe we get more talent in the Valley. Some have gone out of California. And for those people, it was having more space. They were cooped up in apartments and maybe their families' houses during the pandemic. But it was also, I could live where I can afford a house. Well, if they go to other places, that's maybe a good thing in some ways because it encourages development in those places. But I tell you, if you go to Bend, Oregon, or Boise, Idaho, or a lot of places in the West, they hate Californians because Californians are driving up their housing costs because Californians show up and they can afford to pay twice the cost of a house on the market. So we're exporting our problem elsewhere. But it is if you believe that the fundamental issue is talent and attracting talent, we need to keep the doors open to people coming from out of the country. We need to raise our own talent, especially bringing more minorities into this innovation community. In the end of the day, if you can't afford to live here and you'll have a better quality of life someplace else, it may be a good job because tech is being spread more widely across the US than it was now. It's not good for California's growth. And by the way, I think it's fine if tech invests all around the country, and if other tech communities grow up, it kind of spreads the wealth. It's pretty concentrated here. So it's not a bad thing, except that we need to make sure we continue to keep the best minds and the best talent here for the reason that we're the most innovative, most productive place for them to be. And for that, they need to afford to live here.
Thank you, Sean. There's so much more in that report and others, including just what an engine of growth the University of California system, the Cal State system, and the community colleges as well, right? We have the best university systems in the world, let alone public university systems in the world. And thankfully, the state, especially in times of plenty, is investing more there. Folks, this is just
I have something to David's comment, just on climate. Our report, you stimulated me to think here. Our report talked about the importance of investing in renewable energy and climate resilience. And we phrased it in terms of wildfires and the quality of life effect of permanent smoke in times of year. But also, there is this question of sea level rise, which is coming, and it will affect coastal communities all across California. And going to Erica's comment about capacity in local government, there's very little capacity in local governments, except the big cities, to think about this and plan for it. And it's all connected. You can't do it one town at a time. So in the Bay Area, the Bay Area Conservation and Development Commission is working with other agencies and with local communities and environmentalists and businesses about a plan and a strategy. But a lot about that is about enabling and empowering local governments and private entities to think together and plan together, because again, we can have all the tech companies in the world on San Francisco Bay, and if the water goes up 5 feet, you've got an issue.
Thank you, Sean. Well, just before we close, one additional thought. Often we think in broad brushes or sound bites and stereotypes, and one of the things you'll often hear is that we are over-regulated in California and it's choking innovation. But especially when we think about environmental regulations in California, they have enabled so much amazing technology. We are creating markets that are not only hopefully going to save California, but hopefully save the planet as well. And that's something that's important to keep in mind. Now, I don't want to go to the other extreme and paint another very broad brush, because when we've talked about CEQA, for example, CEQA has been used and abused in so many ways that delay progress, that don't uphold the kinds of values that we would like to see in terms of inclusion, in terms of equity, in terms of providing opportunities to so many people who feel like they've been shut out of the California dream. This is the beginning of the work, folks. What you'll see with all of this research, there's some answers, but there are a lot of questions. And that's what we'll be doing in the weeks and months ahead. We're going to have 3 more events with batches of reports, but we're going to take it out to California. Many of you follow us on social media. Please continue sending questions, challenge us, push us to do better. These are some of the brightest minds in California, but there are many more amazing bright minds, and it's not just in universities and colleges. Expertise is everywhere in California, in government agencies, in industry, in community organizations. We hope to harness all of that, and with commissioners like Annie and so many more, we're going to pull it all together. We're going to go through listening sessions. We're going to have deliberative democracy exercises. We're going to pull it all together to try to build a vision for the future of California. By the way, our young people, we're going to have a parallel process. Here in Sacramento, we're hoping in about a year from now to have a youth summit that will create a manifesto or manifestos for the future. We can't talk about the future of California without making sure that young people have authorship and voice in what that future needs to be. And we're going to bring it all together and hopefully use this as a launch to really propel California forward. California has done very big things before. It feels like we're on the steps of something big over the next few years. And we'd love to have you all on this journey with us. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at our next event.